research into it, I find that very much he's pretty close with the John A. Macdonald Conservatives and acts as a backroom advisor and fundraiser. And he was offered a directorship on the Canadian Pacific Railway as part of the deal, which never happened. However, in Ottawa, the delegation is well received, and in the Gold Rush book I did an essay about the third member, who I just blanked out on his name, who represents the gold mining interests of Barkerville. Like, if we join Canada, we bring mineral wealth to Canada and all of that. Dr. Helmcken's view is, how are finances going to work? Because in a gold rush society, the only way a government makes land is on the sale of, makes revenue is on the sale of land, but more importantly, on the taxes on imported goods. So let's pretend you wanted to bring in a deck of playing cards from San Francisco. The tax is $15. Or you could buy a deck of British cards for under $1. So it's the revenue on alcohol, on foods, on mining equipment, anything that you bring in is taxable. And that's what the colony was using to pay for its infrastructure, which was a road to the gold fields. So by the time of Confederation, we were broke. The miners had left, by and large. Some stayed, but most had moved on to the next gold rush somewhere else. And the debts were beyond the means of the colony to pay for them, so we were broke. So his job was to figure out how transfer payments would work. Okay, because if you join Canada, Canada is now in charge of your customs and excise. So you no longer have 60 to 70% of the income, because land doesn't generate very much in the way of funding. You have 60 to 70% of the income is coming from customs and excise, and you'll lose that. So those were the issues that he handled. After that, he is offered a patronage appointment as a senator by John A. Macdonald, and he turns it down. He writes a famous letter where he says, "No, I'm going to return to my medical practice because of the death of my wife. My bairns need their porridge," was the phrase he used, because he's talking to a Scot, even though he's German. The more you think about it, the more you go, well, that's a carefully chosen phrase, isn't it? And if that's all he did, that would be an important career. I mean, I brushed over things like his role as a public health officer in the smallpox epidemic of 1862. He inoculates Chief Freesey, his wife, and over 50 members of the Songhees First Nation. The record seems to show that nobody in the Songhees First Nation died of smallpox. But at the course of a 30-day epidemic, they ran out of serum. The dried blisters from cowpox are picked off and put in containers, and little flakes of that, kept hopefully as a live virus, are put in a little cut in your arm, inserted, and then band-aided over, and that's how you're inoculated in those days for smallpox. So it requires you to have a certain amount, and they ran out quite quickly. They used all of the stocks on all the naval ships, all the merchant ships, everything Dr. Helmcken had. All of that is covered in the Times Columnist, and there's extracts of that in the interpretation. He's a friend of the Sisters of St. Anne's, although he's a Lutheran and not a Catholic. So he's one of the early physicians that supports the Sisters of St. Anne in founding a hospital, St. Joseph's. His son-in-law, his daughter's son-in-law, has an attack and drops in the street and dies in the surgery of St. Joseph's Hospital in the afternoon with the doctor and 3 other physicians trying to save him. And his widowed daughter becomes the caretaker for him for the rest of his life. So he has good relations there. He's also part of this founding supporter for the Francophone community, which almost on the grounds of St. Anne's, it's long gone now, had a subscription hospital. If you were Francophone, you paid so much a month, doctor on retainer, and a hospital was built. So for the Francophone Society, he was one of their founding guides in their arrangements. There's a cup in Helmcken House presented to him by the Francophone Society for his services for healthcare to the Francophone Society. And the big one is the Royal Jubilee Hospital. So he's on that porch greeting the son of Queen Victoria when, for her Jubilee, they come to open the new ward. And he's the lower hat, and the higher hat is his son, who's then secretary of the BC Medical Association. And so he and his son worked on drafting the first medical act, which states what you have to do to be a licensed physician in the province of BC. And like everywhere else in the world, like those guilds I mentioned in London, Edinburgh, and Dublin, physicians form a network to keep outsiders from practicing medicine. Otherwise, anybody who wants to can claim to be a doctor. And so they start regulating themselves, first in cities, then nationally. And then for the province of British Columbia, we put in place our own medical thing, our own medical legislation. And the function of that is to stop people from just getting off a boat from California or Australia and hanging out a shingle. What if there are too many physicians? What if there's not enough for any of them to earn a living, and so forth? So he's part of that.
The son's name?
Hmm?
The son's name? One was Jim, wasn't it? Oh, and Harry.
James Tuzwitz. Oops, sorry. Harry is the lawyer. The sons are, there's 7 children in all. 3 die. His wife, Cecilia, dies, but not in childbirth. She dies of sort of a pneumonia infection a couple of months later, and the baby dies about 4 months later. She had a reoccurring health problem all through her life, and it's not quite clear what that is. John Adams has been trying to sort out that as well. Of the 4 children who lived, and 2 of the children were buried behind where the trees are, right behind the bedroom windows. But when the mother died, they were all disinterred and placed up in Pioneer Cemetery so they could be buried with their mother. I'm rushing ahead a little bit. The children are really pretty interesting. It gets a little harder for you because they use nicknames. So Dolly is Edith Louisa, the youngest, and she's, being the youngest, is the one who's there at the end taking care of her elderly father until he passes away in 1920. She lives in the house till she dies in 1939. Both of the boys are sent to private boarding schools in Scotland, and so they're away from their father for 5 or 6 years. The girls are kept fairly close to home. They're educated by the Sisters of St. Anne, so Lutheran background, but they have a Catholic education. And then on to finishing school in Toronto. Both of them do grand tours of Europe for the final haulage, where you go to see Paris and Milan and so forth. I believe Dolly meets her husband in Milan, where he's studying opera voice. The family's very musical. We have a guitar from the family in the exhibit that came in recently from the family. So that front parlor was filled with music and family events. We have a good record of that. Some played piano, some sang, some played guitar. Amy has an unfortunate marriage. The husband runs off. A second marriage to a McTavish who is not the fur trade McTavish. It's a more recent McTavish arrival. His money was made in greenhouses around Beacon Hill Park, and he was a florist and quite successful. And their aunt would come to visit Martha Harris Douglas, which would have been their mother's sister, and you'll see some of her paintings and watercolors scattered about the house. St. Anne's, for example, wax flower making called shades. You'll see those under the glass domes. Those were made by them in classes taught at St. Anne's. They were also taught painting ceramics. The knit rugs were constructed really out of mail order kits that you could get, quite popular in the 1890s, 1900s, coming out of Eastern Canada. As a family, they would go to the IMAX, back when it was Governor General's house, Governor Douglas's house. And that's the front porch with their grandmother for Martha Harris Douglas's wedding, and everyone gathered there. We have one or two of the window shutters that we found in the Helmcken attic, and they're the same as the shutters in this window. I suspect they came from the Douglas house. There's a shot of the family gathering for the wedding. James Douglas dies at home in the parlor in a family chair, which was given to us by the family after it was recovered by the family in the 1960s, because everybody thought that their great aunt was, why do you keep that thing with all the stuff sticking out of it? So she had it redone in Norwegian orange upholstery, very teak and IKEA-ish. But it is the chair, and the chair is well described. The death of Douglas is recounted in the papers. Dr. Helmcken is attending him. He has a weak heart condition. Leans back in the chair, surrounded by his family, and out comes his last breath. Dr. Helmcken, from the 1900s on, the last 20 years of his life, and he lives till 96, he lives pretty much in the company of women, surrounded by daughters, friends, and family, garden parties. This is about 1902 to 1905. It's either Christmas or New Year's dinner. We have two shots, and the dining room is based around these photographs when we did the revision in 2005, I think it was. We paid a lot of attention to this one in terms of what was hanging where. And there's Christmas in Helmcken House again. Just above his head are his two sons, and it always struck me, with the knowledge of them being sent away as young men to residential schools, I thought, they look overweight and unhappy. Just an observation, although we all get larger as we get older, unless we get thinner. We hope we don't get thinner quick, because that leads to concerns with your doctor. And here's Dr. Helmcken smoking his pipe. Dolly is behind the teapot in the center of that photograph. Some of these were around the house. Some of them were elsewhere in James Bay for these photos. There are commissioned oil portraits. He's held in grand esteem. As late as 1900, they're naming Helmcken Falls for him, which is bigger than Niagara Falls, and really worth seeing. Up in what's the name of the park? I was going to say Strathcona. Wellsgrave, in Wellsgrave. Yeah, if you're taking the long road up to Edmonton. Yeah. But you have to sort of detour about 30 kilometers to see it and then back to the road. And we've got some lovely, distinguished photographs. Things are done for his birthday. There's folklore bits that I haven't been able to trace down. That corner up here is the first place that they put a lowered curb for the doctor when he goes to Beacon Hill Park for his walk, and that the city works people actually lowered the curb there, and that's the first place it happened, maybe. And there he is in his garden at Helmcken House on the side. The one closest to the hedge, I believe, is the family crypt in Pioneer, the Pioneer Cemetery, which has had a heritage overhaul. I was quite curious to find out that he was cremated in Vancouver. And I thought, did he leave his body to medical science? What's that all about? That was answered for me by John Adams and the Heritage Cemetery Society that pointed out that by the time he died in 1920, with street cars going by, which is quite a dramatic change from a fort with a stockade and travel by canoe to electric streetcars, registered cemetery. And it's against the law to bury a human body in the cemetery under city bylaws. However, you could place ashes in the crypt. So he is cremated in Vancouver, which is the only place that's doing this, and then his ashes are brought back to be put into the crypt with his wife and their children. More recently, I found out something really interesting, which is that my signs around Helmcken House, which were based on known information at that time, are incorrect. And it has to do with this photograph. This is the oldest known photo of the house. The date is very precise. It's in November 1859. I think there's even a date, but I couldn't look it up. But it's noted in the photographer's diary. And this is a detail of a glass plate, 360-degree photograph taken of Victoria by the military members of the U.S. Boundary Survey, who like to take pictures of places that they occasionally might go to war with, and they did go to war in 1812. So they set up a camera and did a really good military precision photograph survey of Victoria when they came through. And this is just one small section of a very large photo that's only one of the 4 photos that show the whole view of Victoria. And the Library of Congress, because it has to do with the boundary of the United States of America, scanned it and made it available for free in a 100 meg file. So I downloaded 400 meg of photos of Victoria, which is just 4 photos, and then I zoomed in, and because glass plates don't break down, unlike digital photos, I could zoom right in and crop out this little shot that shows us Helmcken House on the left, and the big house is Governor Douglas's residence. And what I loved about the photo is there are the fences. There are the canoes down at the mud flats, which is the original James Bay, an actual bay. There's a stable up on the left of the darkened pine tree, and there's another carriage house over to the right. Most of these places had outdoor cooking kitchens and so forth, but what really hit me about it is, this is November 1859, so it's really clear and provable that the second extension of the house did not exist in November 1859. And it is there in a late 1860s, 61 Sarah Crease watercolor. Therefore, the house is not built in 52 and then again in 56. No, 3 years later, it still hasn't had the extension built. So the middle part, which is where the dining room is, isn't built till about 1860. We didn't know that when we did the restoration. So you're always getting new information.
Which house is really the one? Is it on this far left?
So take the dark tree. So there's Helmcken House right there. This is a smaller house and carriage area there. And this one is the Douglas house, the really large house, with the porch where the wedding was. I showed you the wedding photos. And so there's the divisions of the yards. And what I'm really looking for is where are the outhouses? I still haven't found the outhouses yet. Because as archaeologists tell you, people throw the most amazing things down at outhouses. The other thing is he had 3 wells, because if you read in the book, and you'll see it in the panels in the house, the first 1 or 2 didn't really work very well. He had to dig a new well. So those are interesting features of the landscape. We still don't know the answer. We haven't had like a side scan sonar survey of the precinct, which would show us if there were underground structures, pits for toilets, wells, things like that. But he does mention the well was stone lined. It was created by the local Songhees Forum. The house is really interesting because it's very cosmopolitan. It's Hawaiian Islanders are splitting shingles. It's a Scottish tradesman who's putting in the windows and the doors. It's First Nations who are supplying the logs, which are dragged down here and then sawn up. So it's a very multi-ethnic house crew that built the house for them. And it's built in a traditional French-Canadian design, the logs underneath.
You're talking about Douglas or Helmcken House?
Sorry, I'm talking about